Hey, welcome everyone to the Worm Bin Composting webinar. My name is Peter Dubois. I coordinate the Master Composter Recycler program for Clark County Public Health. And I wanted to start out with a question for you. How many of you out there have pets? And I know many people have pets. I have a pet cat. Think of a time when your pet brought a nice smile to your face, something they did silly, because it's good to smile. And when you think about pets and their needs, some of the key things, of course, are going to be food. They need water, shelter, in some cases, grooming. They might need, well, hopefully they don't need any trips to the vet. And the most important, and I love to get the kids in the classrooms to get this one, is love and caring. And so provided with a good environment, your red worms require little maintenance and attention, and they make great pets, worming their way into your heart. So we're going to start today to help you get familiar with this new kind of pet. One that can transform your kitchen scraps, leaves, shredded paper into living soil. And we're going to learn how to maintain a bin, how to harvest those worm castings, and how to even use those castings, which are really valuable for your garden. The star of the show is red. And it's more formally known as the Acinia fetida worm. And some other names are red wiggler, the brandling worm, tiger worm, manure worm, or fish worm. And you can find these in the top layers. So if you're out in nature and you've got a leaf pile and you flip it over, you might see some red worms there. They like to be on top with just a small covering. You might find them in worm piles. Really, any worm that is a red worm is going to be okay in a bin. These ones are also tiger worms with the nice stripes you can see, so you can identify them. And they do a great job, and we're going to talk more about it. So these red worms are prolific, and they can live in captivity in a small bin, eating your food scraps. They will be mature, which means they can actually lay cocoons and make babies in 3 months. And you'll notice that when they have the band around their neck, which is called the clitellum. And out of that, each worm is a hermaphrodite. So they're male and female. If you see them twisted together like a pretzel, they are actually mating. And out from that clitellum will slide one of these cocoons. And so you can always see the little tip where the clitellum closed and it secreted out this cocoon. In each of those, an average of 3 little baby worms can grow and continue the life in your bin. It's really fun to find these. It shows that your bin is in production mode, and they're just cool, especially if you have kids, to help them find the cocoon, go on an egg hunt. One thing to know about cocoons is they're very durable. They can actually live up to 18 months if the conditions were to dry out for one reason and the worms were to die. You could bring your worm bin back. And so that's good news in case something were to go wrong. Okay. When we are talking about our worm bins, we actually have a living ecosystem going on in there. There are billions of bacteria. There are fungi. The bacteria are actually a vital player because the red worms lack the enzymes, just like we have saliva in our mouth to help break down food that we chew. The bacteria have the enzymes that help break down what the worms will digest through their gizzard and then through the rest of them. And they rely on these microbes to do it. Let's go through some of these critters one by one, because it is important to be up close and personal and understand what's happening in your bin. So we'll start in the upper left corner where we have mites, and you might see a sea of red or white dots, especially around rotting food. And these are the mites, and they like wet conditions. So typically that's when you're going to find them. Molds and fungi secrete enzymes, which also help break down things in the bin. So they can be a very important role. They can grow in large amounts when the bin is very still. So that might show that you have just fed too much so that the worms aren't disturbing it and things aren't moving around. So that's something to be aware of. Pot worms are tiny hair-like white worms measuring about 1/4 of an inch. Sometimes they may be confused for a baby worm, but even baby red worms are going to be reddish, and these are clearly a white. They also like wet conditions, so that may be a signal that your bin is wet. Okay, we'll go down to the middle. On the left, we've got sow bugs and then pill bugs. Pill bugs are the roly-polies. The difference here is with the pill bugs, if you touch them, they roll up, and the sow bugs don't. Both these critters are wonderful. They are shredders, and they actually are helping to break down some of that more woody material that you might have in your bin, especially some of the bedding, which we'll talk about. Okay, the pesky fruit fly. If you're going to be tending worms, more likely than not, you may encounter a pesky fruit fly. These come in on the fruits and vegetables, the eggs that we buy at the store. They're already there. And an adult fruit fly can lay 500 eggs in their 7-day life cycle. So we will talk about troubleshooting. There are ways you can add extra layers of bedding to try to keep these flies where they want to go into your bin and lay their eggs on the decaying fruit and vegetable matter. So to make that as hard as possible, you can bring your bin outside if you have that opportunity and just let the flies out and dry out a little bit. Fruit flies, traps, you can certainly find on YouTube. And then it's something I've never tried, but I read about, you can drape a fine woven piece of cloth over your bin. So if that's something you try and have success, that would be great to know. Other people will actually freeze their food or even microwave it for 2 minutes to kill those eggs. Millipedes, which is pictured here, again, they are shredders and they are really great. They're vegetarians. They're going to be a wonderful addition to your bin. If you happen to have a centipede, which is a little bit more of like a furry looking critter that moves really fast and is actually a little bit creepy crawly, those actually are predators and they will kill your worms. So that's the one you'll want to be careful and remove that from your worm bin. And you can put it out in your garden where they're doing their job as a good predator out there. Okay, just below that are the springtails, which are tiny white specks. They almost can jump around in your bin. And these feed on mold, and they love wet conditions. So again, these could be a signal that your bin might be too wet. And then we've got some pesky ants, which typically can be dealt with by keeping your area nice and tidy. And then our final one, moving in the other direction, are soldier fly larvae. And these are about 1/2 inch in size. They can also be referred to as maggots. And so here they are in their larval stage where they're harmless. And they're harmless to the worms. And they are great decomposers. In this larval stage, they actually have mouths and they are consuming large amounts of food, and they are a top-notch decomposer, making excellent high-quality castings. When they do hatch, they hatch into a black soldier fly, which will not have a mouth, and it's harmless. It can't bite, it can't spread any germs. It lives about 7 days just to lay its eggs and to repeat the cycle. So the only issue, if you open up your bin and you see a big mass of these creepy crawly soldier fly larvae, they might just be able to outcompete your worms for food. So you may need to remove them just because you obviously want your worms, your pets, to be fed and happy. But these are good decomposers. If you happen to see slugs or snails in your bin, those are things you might want to remove, primarily just because they lay an abundance of eggs, and then you certainly don't want to be spreading that around. Okay, so now that we've just gotten a little bit of a taste of what we would be inheriting as a new foster home to these worm bins and these worms, the real reason why we're doing this, clearly we want to keep food scraps from going to the landfill, but we are going to be manufacturing and making a soil, almost like a humus, a really decomposed material that is many times more valuable than soil nutritionally in nitrogen, phosphate, potassium, magnesium, calcium. And you can see they've done studies that actually show this natural fertilizer will outperform chemical fertilizers as well. So it really is a wonderful nutritional addition in your gardening. And I know you're attending this webinar because you are interested in getting worms. So hopefully the sales pitch was pretty quick and easy. And you're now ready to launch into the, how do I get this going? You'll want a place for your worm bin. I keep mine out in my garage or a tool or potting shed. I have heard folks that have success keeping it in their homes, in their basement, even under their kitchen sink. The main nuisance, again, would be fruit flies, but typically they prefer the condition in the bin. So even if you open the lid and they all come out, eventually they'll go back in. If it is outdoors, you don't want it clearly to be out in sunlight where there's a lot of rain that could get in your bin and saturate it. So be thinking about these as pets and that you want to provide a nice shelter for them. When you get your worm bins, when we distribute worm bins through our program, we have bedding in them so the worms are already established. Sometimes if you just buy worms through the mail and put them in your bin, there can be a transition which can stress out the worms. And you may have read you should keep your bin lid off with a light over it, and that the worms do not like light because they'll dry out and die. So that is a good way to keep your worms in your bin during those initial phases. But the bedding is very important to get right. We want it to be moist, like a wrung out sponge. And we also want it to be fluffy because the worms are going to be creating tunnels. This is basically where they live. And they will have slime off of their bodies that seal these tunnels. So they have oxygen flowing through, and worms breathe through their skin. So that gives them their opportunity to thrive and survive. Also, in our conditions, you want to have enough bedding so there's some insulation for really cold days and really hot days. Typically, worms are okay between 35 to 85 degrees in their bedding temperature. So if you have enough bedding and it hits 100 degrees, there should be enough insulation that bedding is still staying cool enough. And the same would apply in our cold winter months. So the bedding is also known as our browns. And if you've taken our backyard composting webinar, composting browns are known as our carbon material. And carbon is actually a food source both in your backyard compost bin and in your worm bin, and it provides the energy that life requires, carbon. And there are many forms to find this. Typically, it's going to be your dry materials. You can shred up your egg cartons, your toilet paper rolls. You can cut cardboard into smaller pieces. Shredded paper works fine. You can do strips of newsprint. One of my favorites for worms, because they love to live in leaves, would be to collect leaves in the fall and stockpile them all year long so I can use them. You can use them dry and crumbly. I actually like to compost my leaves so they are moist and starting to break down, and it really gives a wonderful bedding and a brown material for your worm bin. And it's a pretty simple process to do. You can actually collect leaves in the fall, and when they are moistened, just put them in a heavy-duty contractor bag, poke some holes in it, set it aside, and in 9 months to a year, you can open that bag and you will have 100% compost made of leaves. And leaves are very high in mineral content as well. You can just put it into a pile, you can put it in a bin. I definitely recommend, if you're going to be a worm wrangler, to start leaf composting. So our other side of the equation are our composting greens, and these would be our nitrogen, which is important for protein production to allow our populations and breeding and some of those other critical functions that we need for life. And in a worm bin, we'll spend some time on this, but the primary rule of thumb is any fruit or vegetable is going to be great for your worm. Of course, if you can chop it up into smaller pieces, that's going to help make it disappear quicker and speed up the process. You can also, if you're collecting food waste, and it gets a little bit sloppy, I like to drain off the water. So we're going to talk more about moisture, but that's probably a number one troubleshooting issue, is having your bin get too wet. Okay, so as we spoke, pretty much all fruits and vegetables are going to be good in your bin. There are some exceptions, and I'll go through those. Citrus, and I'm sure if you've read or delved into worm harvesting and worm composting, the issue with citrus is that if you put too much in, it's acidic and it can change the pH, because our bins are pretty small. If it was a large bin and the worms had a place where they could escape for some time and come back, no big deal. But in a small bin, we really need to be thinking about feeding them the foods that they like. Also, if you've ever noticed a lemon or an orange, when it starts to decompose, if you've kept it in your house too long, it will start to mold, and that's the process there. So if you were to put in some moldy bread along with your citrus, that introduces mold into your bin and actually helps it break down, and the worms can then, and the fungus and the springtails and all the critters can get to work on that. So it's not like citrus is going to poison your worms. Banana skins, I've heard a couple things here. I've put both conventional and organic banana peels in my bin. I've had no problems. They do use a lot of pesticides for fungus problems with these banana plantations. They're a monocrop. So that's something just to be familiar with. If you see a banana peel and the worms aren't touching it, then you might not want to do that. I haven't had that issue. You might have heard potato skins, onions, garlic. All of those are fine, but they could create a smell. And certainly you wouldn't want to put in a full feeding of just onions and garlic. And then avocados, I've heard mixed bag, but I've had no problem with avocados. Worms breathe through their skin. Avocados can be oily, but I've also found that they like going in the avocado shell, and you'll actually find lots of little worms crawled up in there. The pits, of course, are going to hang out forever. Okay, some other things that you can feed your worms. They love coffee, and the filter is fine. The filter would actually be a brown, a dry material. And you would want to limit just that certain amount, maybe up 20, 30% of your feeding to be coffee. Tea bags and teas are fine as well. And eggshells are very good. Worms have gizzards, so they actually crush their material. And those little fine pieces, I read somewhere, I don't do this, that you can put your eggshells, dry them, put them in a baggie and roll them with a rolling pin to kind of pulverize them. So there's lots of different methods. And then we'll talk a little bit more on feeding, but you can put grains in your bin. You just want to make sure that you're not attracting any rodents. There are some harmful foods, and those are pretty straightforward. Your dairy, obviously you wouldn't want to put in your cheese, no meats because they're going to rot and stink. Any fats, oils, and greases, mayonnaise, salad dressings, any of those things, because the worms just aren't going to like that. Again, they breathe through their skin. Grass clippings come up. This really is more of a food scrap bin. Grass clippings would be better left on your lawn or in your backyard compost bin. In large amounts in a worm bin, they can actually decompose and generate a lot of heat and cause worms problems. And then clearly no cat or dog feces in any kind of composting because of the parasites and toxins and pathogens. Okay, so I know that was a lot. I do welcome questions, answers. You can always reach us and we'll have contact information for you. But we are at clarkcountycomposts.org is our website, and we'll announce that again. And feeding, there are certainly a variety of ways that you can feed your bin. We like to feed, and I like to feed my bin weekly. That way I have a good opportunity and I can remember where I put my food last and just see how quickly it's decomposing and how if the worms are in there working. I like to do just 1/2 of the bin aside again, just so I can discover where I put it and see how it's all being broken down. And whenever you feed your wet, which would be your composting green, you always cover with a layer of bedding. And that's important for keeping down the fruit flies and other pests. But the worms, again, they eat the carbon as it breaks down, and they'll eat the wet nitrogen materials as well. I can, sometimes I will cover my bin with a moist newspaper blanket. That just keeps the conditions ideal. There's lots of different ways to do that. We'll be demonstrating some of that in our video clip. Okay, how much can you feed? And worms should eat half their weight per day. And worm bins are based on their surface area because, again, worms feed at the surface, just like we talked about the worms in a leaf pile. They are on top of the environment. And our bins are about 1 square foot, and each square foot can be the correct environment for up to 1 pound of worms, which is about 1,000 worms, so quite a few. And so each pound can eat half their weight every day, so we're looking at about 3.5 pounds of food per week. You can actually work your bin up to 1 gallon of food a week under good conditions. And as I said, every time you feed, you're going to be covering with that brown material. So equal portions of green and browns. You're not going to want to overfeed your bin, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Food and vegetables, fruit and vegetable waste is 80% water. So every time you're putting that material in your bin, you're introducing a lot of water. That's partly why we have our bedding to absorb some of that moisture and why we always cover it with a brown material. We get some questions sometimes, what about if I'm going to go on vacation? And one thing you can do is you can you can leave your worm bin for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, even up to 4 weeks. You can sprinkle a cup or 2 of flour or cornmeal, even oatmeal, or a mix, and do a thin layer over the whole bin or half the bin, and then cover it with some thin bedding, moist bedding. And that will be an easy diet for your worms to kind of maintain themselves over that time. Okay, so I think the biggest issue that I've run into, and I have run into this as well, are when the conditions get too wet. And the good news is the nose knows. And so if you've got a bin that you've just somehow dumped too much wet food in, and it's gone anaerobic, which again means that it's drenched and soggy and filled up all the spaces so that there's no oxygen flow anymore. And then the wrong bacteria come in there and they start to stink. We really do want to get our feeding ratios correct. And so the biggest way to fix this issue would be just to stop feeding it, because every time you feed it, you're introducing water. This is the only time that you would maybe gently stir your bin. The worms are always working their way up in the worm bin. We never turn a worm bin. That's something you might do in a compost out in your backyard. But in the worms, we're basically building a layer upon layer. So if you think about it, you feed your food, you cover it on one side, and then you come to the next side, you feed it and you cover it, and then you go to the other side. And so you're always just building up your bin until it gets to the very top when it's time to harvest. If you have a wet bin, certainly can check on the leachate, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. And then you can add more brown, dry material. Just put it right in dry. It will absorb some of that moisture. Okay, things that will, this is a bin that has a spout built in. I like to leave those spouts open so I can manage what's coming out leachate-wise. In the bins that we provide through our program, we just have a cork and a small drain hole. So you'll need to figure out the best way to manage that moisture. Ideally, in ideal conditions, really only 2 to 3 ounces of this leachate would be coming out each week. If you're seeing a situation here where an entire cup is filling up over a day, your bin is too wet. And so you're going to need to scale back or figure out ways to dry that bin out over time, primarily like we did in the last slide, by stop feeding until things dry out. So leachate is not compost tea. Compost tea would be where you have a pump and you're actually introducing oxygen and you're aerating this and bringing a large life form and then using that within 1 to 2 hours, typically. Leachate is just the drippings that have come through your bin. They're primarily going to be good critters, but they might have some bad critters in them. So we recommend diluting this about 10 to 1 and then spreading it anywhere in your garden except on things like lettuce or spinach that touch the soil and that you might pick and eat just for safety reasons. But this is a very nutritional. I like to use it in my houseplants. Again, it's a good material to be using, just not on things you might eat. Okay, my colleague sent me this picture, and this was unbelievable. We had just a huge population explosion in this bin. This would be a great opportunity to quickly get these worms. This must be 5 to 6 pounds of worms. Split these maybe into 5 or 6 piles, put them in some nice moist bedding, and really find someone who needs worms. What actually ended up happening here is we had a wormicide. Most of these worms died off. When you see worms balling up, that's a sign that they are stressed for one reason or another. This might have just been too many worms and not enough food. The conditions, for one reason, the pH might get off. You might feed them something that they don't like, salty food, oily food. And so that is typically a really good sign that you better be paying close attention to what's going on, or else your worms are going to make a break for it. They can also just all of a sudden leave your bin or have a mass die-off. Okay, so as I mentioned, we will be layering our bins on half the side we feed one week, then we feed the next side the other week, and we always are covering it with browns. And over time, that material is going to be consumed by the red worms and all the critters in the bin, the decomposers, and your bin will fill up. And at that point, and you can see here, we've actually removed the top layer of bedding that was actively being fed. We stopped feeding it for a little bit, and we're now ready to harvest this material. It should be black, it should be crumbly, it should smell like earth. And there are a couple different ways to harvest that material. One is you can scoop off that top working area where you have your bedding and you've got your food and you've got your primarily 70–80% of your worms. And you can just set that aside and dump out the contents either into your garden, or you can put it into a 5-gallon bucket is typically what I do. And then you return the 3 to 6 inches that you had removed and you just start your bin again. So very simple process. The issue is how willing you are to lose your worms that weren't recovered in that top layer, because there will be worms still working through your whole bin. A couple things you can do if you really don't want any worms to perish, which is certainly a noble goal and one I strive for. You can also dump, before it goes in the bucket, into a mound, and over about a 24-hour period of time, the worms will always stay away from the light, and you can scoop off the top parts and then to get to the bottom where all the worms are. Also in your bucket where you store your material, this is one where I keep a wet newspaper blanket on top. You wouldn't want to snap a tight-fitting lid because there's still decomposition occurring in this bin, in the bucket storage area. So you need some oxygen to come in there. And so I removed the blanket just so you can look in and see that storage. You could also bait your bucket. You could put a melon rind or a piece of moist bread, something that the worms are going to want to come up and eat, and then remove them over time as well. So using your vermicompost, now that we actually have got this miracle, nature's miracle grow material for our gardens, really the general rule of thumb is a little goes a long way. And you're looking at about up to 10 to 20% of your potting mix or your planting medium can be used with vermicompost. And castings are going to comprise 70 to 80% of what you put in your bin. There will be some other decomposed materials. And I have found that about a gallon of vermicompost will be enough fertilizer nutrients for a typical 4-foot by 8-foot garden bed. So you can see really potent stuff and really great. You can sprinkle it right on your house plants, just a top layer, or your garden plants. You can spread in your seed rows. It's really great to get that material down where the plant roots are going to be so they can get to those plant soluble ready nutrients. And you can also put it in a potting mix. I use 3 parts leaf compost to 1 part vermicompost, so I never need to buy potting mix. You can also do 1 part vermicompost to a part soil and regular backyard compost. You can experiment, but it's about a 1 to 3, 1 to 4 ratio there, and it's great stuff. You may see some different types of worm bins. The one that we've got on the right upper, which look like Rubbermaid totes, which are in fact Rubbermaid totes, that's the bin that we provide through our program. It's kind of a do-it-yourself, and we show you in our video how to do that and make those. We have some supplies and some funding to provide those to the public. They make a great bin. They are plastic, and so they're not as forgiving in terms of condensation and moisture. the material itself does not breathe. So if you open your lid and it's dripping with condensation, you want to make sure that you either crack your lid, add some more dry bedding. You really do need to work harder to maintain your moisture levels. Now, wood, on the other hand, will be more permeable and will allow your bin to breathe. On our website are plans on how to build a wood bin. And then these other bins are called flow-through bins. They have trays, and you would start with one tray, and then you keep adding a tray up to 3 trays, maybe 4, in a vertical fashion. And then the worms will decompose all that material in the tray, and then you start feeding on the next tray above it. The worms will migrate up, and by the time you get to that top 3rd tray, the bottom one has been fully processed, and you can just scoop out beautiful black crumbly vermicompost without having to separate any worms. So really, that is the benefit for those. They are a little bit more expensive than our simple do-it-yourself. All of these systems work just fine, and your worms will be happy in any of them. So just a few questions and answers, and we really do welcome you to email us. You can reach us at mcr@clark.wa.gov. Again, our website is clarkcountycomposts.org. Do you need to add soil to the bin? Sometimes you'll hear that you need to put in a handful of soil because the worms have this gizzard and they need grit. We have not found that to be necessary. You know, if you're putting in eggshells, even your fruits and vegetable materials, your bedding, it all has enough material for your worms to get working and being happy. And do worms eat the food? So this is interesting because there actually is a very well-known book called Worms Eat My Garbage. And worms do not have mouths. I like to think of them more as sifters. And what they're going to do is they're going to graze through this bin and ingest microbes, the tiny little bacteria and fungi, bits of decomposed food. So once it's actually rotted and is more like a slurry, that can go into their mouth, or you know, they don't have teeth, but into their opening. And also that bedding as it starts to break down and decompose. And so that all becomes biologically enhanced through this worm's long intestine is basically what it is, where there's bacteria inside it secreting enzymes and helping it to break down. And so what comes out is a humus-rich worm casting that is full of life. And if you recall, and the same is true with your backyard compost, but a teaspoon of this vermicompost has as much life forms, microorganisms, as up to 1 billion microorganisms in a teaspoon of vermicompost. So this is living soil. When you introduce it into your garden, you're introducing nutrients, micronutrients, and this biologically enhanced material. It's a prebiotic, and it's going to make your soil happy. How long will worms live? In a worm bin, you know, typically they might live to be 2 years. Worms decompose very rapidly as well. So you're going to have worms that are dying and just decomposing as part of the process, new ones hatching out of their cocoons, and so it's a constant cycle. And then where can you get red worms? So our program has been pretty effective at actually trying to raise enough worms to provide bins to folks who come through our trainings. And neighbors and friends, you know, a worm bin can probably be split similar to like sourdough or kombucha starter, 3 up to 3-4 times a year. So if you have a friend with a worm bin, they can scoop out worms for you. And we are lucky in Clark County to have a place called Northwest Red Worms out in Camas, and he does sell worms and also does tours. So we do have a nice local resource. So I really appreciate you guys coming out and tuning in. We will be including a live demonstration clip from the field so you can see some of the techniques of building this do-it-yourself bin, how to harvest, how to feed. And so I do encourage you to view that as well. And thanks so much for tuning in to our worm bin composting webinar.